The transport shuttle rattled like a tin can full of loose screws, which, I suppose, it essentially was. The Zalothian design philosophy seemed to prioritize function over comfort, and by function, they meant the bare minimum required to not disintegrate in atmosphere. My seat cushion had the structural integrity of wet cardboard, and the recycled air carried the faint, metallic aftertaste of a ship that had seen too many decades and too few maintenance cycles. I pressed my forehead against the cold viewport, watching the swirling orange and crimson clouds of Vexus 7 drift beneath us. The planet looked like a dying ember from up here, all fire and smoke and desolate wastelands. The briefing files had called it a minimal habitable world with strategic resource deposits. Translation: it was a hellhole, but it had something the Galactic Coalition wanted. Next to me, Jax was trying to get comfortable, which for a 6.5-foot Zartanian with exoskeletal plating meant folding himself into a shape that defied standard geometry. His mandibles clicked in irritation every time the shuttle hit a patch of turbulence. "I don't understand why we couldn't have done this on the station," he muttered, his translator implant rendering his native clicks and hisses into passable galactic standard. "They have perfectly good forges on the station." "Because the assignment specifies raw material extraction," I said, not looking away from the window. "We have to source the ore ourselves. It's part of the evaluation." "Evaluation," Jax repeated, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt only a being who'd been alive for 3 centuries could properly convey. "We're being evaluated on our ability to dig rocks out of the ground like primitive cave dwellers. This is absurd." I finally turned to look at him. His chitinous face was impossible to read in the human sense, no expressions, no micro-movements of muscle, but I'd learned to read his antennae. They were flat against his skull, which meant he was genuinely annoyed. "It's tradition," I said. "Every class has to do it. The blade forging assignment is supposed to teach us about the foundations of metallurgy, the history of weapon crafting, the—" Yes, the cultural significance," Jax interrupted, waving a 3-fingered hand dismissively. "I've read the syllabus, thank you. I simply fail to see the practical application. We're not going to be blacksmiths. We're training for diplomatic corps. What possible use will I have for knowing how to swing a hammer at molten metal?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the shuttle chose that moment to lurch violently, throwing me against the restraints. Through the viewport, I could see we were entering the lower atmosphere now, the orange clouds giving way to a cracked, barren landscape below. The ground was a mosaic of deep reds and browns, crisscrossed with fissures that looked like wounds in the planet's surface. The instructor's voice crackled over the shuttle's intercom, cutting through the ambient noise of rattling bulkheads and nervous breathing. Instructor Vex was a Krogan, and his voice had all the warmth of grinding stones. "Attention, students. We are beginning our descent to the extraction zone. As per your assignment briefings, you will have 6 standard hours to locate, extract, and begin processing raw materials for your forge blade project. The area has been scouted and deemed safe. Minimal wildlife activity has been detected. However, I remind you that Vexus 7 is classified as a marginal world, and the local ecosystem is not fully cataloged. Exercise caution. Do not wander beyond the designated perimeter. Any infractions will result in immediate disqualification and a failing grade." The intercom clicked off, leaving us in silence punctuated by the groan of the shuttle's straining engines. "Minimal wildlife activity," Jax repeated, his antennae twitching. "That's reassuring. When a Krogan tells you something is minimal, it usually means there are only 4 or 5 things that could kill you instead of 20. I couldn't help but smile. "You're such an optimist." "I'm a realist. There's a difference." The shuttle descended through the final layer of clouds, and Vexus 7 revealed itself in all its ugly glory. The landing zone was a flat plateau of reddish-brown rock, surrounded by jagged outcroppings that looked like the petrified remains of some giant creature. The sky was a sickly yellow, and a faint haze hung over everything, blurring the distant horizon. The air, when the shuttle's hatch finally hissed open, was dry and hot, carrying the scent of dust and minerals and something else, something faintly organic, like the smell of old bones left out in the sun. I stepped off the ramp and onto the surface, feeling the crunch of loose gravel under my boots. The gravity was slightly heavier than standard, maybe 1.2 gs, and I could feel it in my joints. Behind me, the rest of the class was disembarking, a motley collection of species from across the galaxy. There were two more Zartanians besides Jax, a trio of slender, blue-skinned Velari who moved with the eerie grace of dancers, a massive Borog who looked like a walking boulder, and a handful of others I hadn't bothered to memorize the names of. And then there was Ilara. She was the only other human in the class, and we developed a sort of unspoken solidarity over the months of training. She was shorter than me, with dark hair that she kept tied back in a practical knot and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had a quiet intensity about her that made people underestimate her, which I suspected was exactly how she liked it. She caught my eye as she stepped off the ramp and gave a small shrug, as if to say, "Well, here we are." I shrugged back. Instructor Vex stood at the edge of the landing zone, his massive, reptilian form silhouetted against the yellow sky. He was easily 8 feet tall, with thick, armored scales and a mouth full of teeth that seemed designed for tearing flesh. His yellow eyes scanned the group with the patience of a predator assessing its prey. "You have 6 hours," he said, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "Your goal is to forge a blade that meets the minimum standards of the assignment. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care how you make it. I care only that it holds an edge and doesn't shatter on impact. The top 3 blades will receive commendations. The bottom 3 will require remedial training. You may begin." He turned and walked back toward the shuttle, his heavy footsteps leaving deep impressions in the gravel. The class stood in silence for a moment, exchanging uncertain glances. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, everyone scattered in different directions, heading toward the rocky outcroppings that dotted the landscape. The Velari moved with coordinated precision, their long fingers tracing patterns in the air as they scanned for mineral deposits. The Borog simply started smashing rocks with his fists, sending shards of stone flying in every direction. Jax turned to me, his antennae perked with interest. "Well, where should we start?" I surveyed the area, trying to remember the geological survey data from the briefing. The plateau was mostly sedimentary rock, but the outcroppings to the north showed signs of igneous intrusion, which meant there might be veins of usable ore. "North," I said, pointing. "The basalt formations might have some iron-bearing minerals." Jax nodded and fell into step beside me. Ilara was already ahead of us, moving with deliberate purpose toward the same area. She'd clearly reached the same conclusion. The walk to the outcroppings took about 20 minutes, the terrain growing rockier and more uneven as we went. The heat was oppressive, pressing down on us like a physical weight. I could feel sweat beading on my forehead and running down my back. The environmental controls in our suits were working overtime, but they couldn't quite keep up with the planet's ambient temperature. As we rounded a particularly large formation of reddish-black rock, we found Ilara already there, kneeling on the ground with her hands pressed flat against the surface. She looked up as we approached, her expression unreadable. "Good spot," she said simply. "There's hematite here and something else, something I can't quite identify." Jax crouched beside her, his claws scraping against the rock. "How can you tell? Your species doesn't have the biological sensors for mineral detection." Ilara smiled, a small, secret thing that barely touched her eyes. "I can't, but I can read the rock, the way it's weathered, the color patterns, the crystal structure. It's a skill, not a sense." Jax made a sound that might have been approval or might have been skepticism. It was hard to tell with Zartanians. I knelt down beside them, running my fingers over the rough surface. The rock was warm to the touch, almost hot, and I could see faint streaks of reddish-brown running through it. Hematite, like Alara had said. Good. Hematite was iron oxide. With the right equipment, we could extract the iron and start the forging process. "I'll get the extraction tools," Jax said, rising and heading back toward the shuttle. Alara and I worked in companionable silence for a while, chipping away at the rock and gathering the richest samples. The work was physical, demanding, and I found it oddly soothing. There was something primal about it, something that felt connected to the long history of human craftsmanship that I'd studied in my cultural anthropology classes. I'd always been drawn to that history, to the stories of our ancestors who had worked with their hands, who had taken raw materials from the earth and transformed them into tools and weapons and works of art. It was a part of our heritage that most of humanity had left behind when we joined the Galactic Coalition, trading our forged fires for matter replicators and our handcrafted blades for mass-produced plasma weapons. But here, on this desolate planet, I felt a connection to something ancient. "We should gather enough material for a solid core," Alara said, breaking the silence. "The blade needs to be at least 30 centimeters in length. We'll need to refine the ore first, then fold it then." "I know the process," I said, a little more sharply than I intended. She looked at me, her eyes searching. "I didn't mean to imply you didn't. I was just thinking out loud." I sighed, running a hand through my sweat-damp hair. "Sorry, the heat's getting to me." She nodded, accepting the apology without comment. That was one of the things I liked about Alara. She didn't push. She didn't demand explanations. She just accepted. "The heat's getting to all of us," she said. 6 hours, it's not much time." "We'll make it work." Jax returned with the extraction tools, and we set to work in earnest. The hours passed in a blur of physical labor, the repetitive motions of chipping and gathering and sorting becoming almost meditative. Other students were scattered around the area, each working on their own projects. I could see the Velari using some kind of sonic technology to pulverize rock, their slender forms bending and flowing with an almost hypnotic grace. The Borog had given up on tools and was simply biting chunks out of the formations, which was both impressive and slightly disturbing. By the time the 4-hour mark rolled around, I had a decent pile of hematite ore, along with a few other mineral samples I'd found. Jax had managed to extract a significant amount of copper from a secondary vein, and Alara had discovered a deposit of something that might have been tin, which would be useful for making bronze. "Not a bad haul," I said, surveying our collection. "Not bad at all," Alara agreed. "We should head back to the forge station. We'll need at least 2 hours to refine and shape the blade." Jax nodded, gathering up the samples in the carrying harness we'd brought. "Let's go. I don't want to be the one who fails because I couldn't beat the clock." We started the trek back toward the shuttle, our arms and backs aching from the labor. The yellow sky had faded to a deeper orange, the planet's sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. The shadows of the outcropping stretched long and distorted across the rocky ground. It was on the way back that I first noticed something was wrong. The silence. The plateau had never been exactly noisy, but there had been background sounds, the distant whisper of wind, the faint crunch of gravel underfoot, the occasional cry of some unseen creature. But now it was quiet, too quiet. I stopped walking, holding up a hand to signal the others. "What is it?" Jax asked, his antennae swiveling. "Listen." They fell silent, and I could see Jax's antennae twitching as he tried to pick up any auditory signals. Alara's eyes narrowed, scanning the landscape with sharp intensity. "I don't hear anything," Jax said after a moment. "Exactly." The color drained from Alara's face, or what little color she'd had in the oppressive heat. "Something scared off the wildlife," she said quietly. Something big. "We need to get back to the shuttle," I said, already starting to move. "Now." We broke into a jog, the rocks crunching under our feet as we made our way across the plateau. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. 6 hours. We'd been told the area was safe. We'd been told to stay within the perimeter. The shuttle was visible in the distance, a dark shape against the orange sky. But as I looked at it, I saw something else. Movement at the edge of the plateau, maybe half a kilometer away. I stopped again, squinting into the distance. "What is it?" Alara asked, her voice tight with tension. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because what I was seeing didn't make sense. The shape was large, maybe the size of a ground transport. It moved with a fluid, sinuous motion that suggested something with too many joints and not enough structure. Its color blended almost perfectly with the rocks, a mottled pattern of reds and browns that made it nearly invisible when it was still. But when it moved, I could see the faint shimmer of its hide, like oil on water. It was heading toward the shuttle. "Instructor Vex," I breathed. "He doesn't see it. The shuttle's sensors aren't picking it up." "One of the Velari spotted it," Jax said, his voice urgent. "They're trying to warn him." I looked toward the group of Velari, who were frantically waving their arms and shouting something I couldn't hear. But Instructor Vex was facing the other direction, apparently oblivious to the approaching threat. "We have to help them," Alara said, already breaking into a run. I followed, Jax thundering along beside me. The creature was moving faster now, its body rippling across the rocks with terrifying speed. I could see its head now, or what I assumed was its head, a cluster of sensory organs arranged around a circular mouth lined with sharp, inward-pointing teeth. "Run!" I shouted, my voice carrying across the open space. Instructor Vex finally turned, his yellow eyes widening as he registered the threat, but he was too slow. The creature lunged, a blur of mottled hide and razor-sharp appendages, and I saw the Krogan go down under the weight of the attack. The Velari scattered, their coordination shattered by panic. The Borog charged toward the creature, his massive fists raised, but he was swatted aside like a toy. And then I was there, skidding to a halt, my mind racing. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have any training in combat. I was just a student, a diplomat in training, My hand closed around a piece of bone. I didn't know where it came from. It was lying on the ground at my feet, half buried in the gravel. It was long, maybe 40 centimeters, and thick, with a slight curve that might have been natural or might have been the result of erosion. It was the bone of something large, something that had died here long ago. Without thinking, I scooped it up. The creature had pinned Instructor Vex to the ground, its mouth parts trying to find purchase in his armored hide. He was fighting back, his claws raking deep furrows in its hide, but he was clearly losing. The creature was too big, too strong. I charged, the bone raised like a club. The creature sensed me coming at the last moment, its sensory cluster swiveling toward me. I brought the bone down with all my strength, aiming for the soft-looking tissue between its sensory organs. The bone shattered on impact. But it did something. The creature recoiled, a shrieking sound tearing from its mouth parts. I saw that one of the sensory organs had been crushed, black fluid oozing from the wound. Instructor Vex took advantage of the creature's hesitation, driving his claws deep into its underside. The creature convulsed, releasing its grip, and Vex scrambled backward, his armor scored and bleeding. I grabbed the broken piece of bone, still clutching it in my hand. The edge was ragged, sharp. I could see the jagged point where it had fractured. The creature was turning toward me now, its remaining sensory organs focusing on my position. Its mouth parts gaped open, revealing row after row of needle-sharp teeth. I stood my ground. I didn't think about what I was doing. I didn't think about the odds, or the consequences, or the impossibility of the situation. I just stood there, holding a piece of bone that wasn't even a weapon, and face the thing that was going to kill me. The creature lunged. I moved. It was instinct, pure and simple. My body responded before my mind could catch up. I dropped low, feeling the wind of the creature's passage brush against my hair, and I drove the sharpened bone upward with all the strength I had. It sank deep into the creature's throat. The shriek that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard, a high-pitched, grinding scream that seemed to shake the very air. The creature thrashed wildly, sending rocks flying in every direction. I clung to the bone, riding the creature's death throes, refusing to let go. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The creature collapsed, its body hitting the ground with a heavy thud that I felt through my boots. I stood there, panting, still gripping the blood-slicked bone in my hands. The ragged, sharpened edge was coated in black ichor. I looked down at the creature's carcass. The bone was embedded deep in its throat, the jagged point protruding from the other side. I had killed it. I had killed a creature that had taken down a Krogan, with a piece of bone I'd found on the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. I looked around, my vision swimming. The other students were staring at me, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Instructor Vex was on his feet, his massive form swaying slightly as he pressed a hand to his wounded side. His yellow eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something other than cold assessment in his gaze. I saw respect. Part 2. The aftermath of the attack was a blur of chaos and quiet desperation. The first thing I noticed was the bone in my hands. It was warm, slick with the creature's ichor, and in the fading orange light of the dying sun, it glistened with an almost beautiful sheen. The broken edge where I'd been gripping it had cracked further, leaving a long, jagged sliver that curved slightly like the tooth of some prehistoric predator. I looked at it, really looked at it for the first time. It wasn't just any bone. The marrow cavity was visible at the broken end, but what caught my attention was the density, the grain, the way the mineral deposits had replaced the original organic structure over centuries of being buried in this mineral-rich soil. It was fossilized, petrified, harder than any bone had a right to be. I slowly turned it over in my hands, watching the last rays of the planet's sun dance across its surface. "You saved my life." Instructor Vex's voice cut through the fog in my head. I looked up to find him standing over me, his massive frame blocking out the light. His golden eyes were fixed on the bone in my hands. "Sir, I started, but he raised a hand to cut me off." "The creature," he said, his voice gravelly with pain, "is a Kellian sand crawler. They are classified as alpha predators on this world. They are known to possess a hide that can deflect small arms fire and a venom that can paralyze prey 3 times their size." He paused, his eyes never leaving the bone. "You killed it with a piece of discarded bone, a fossil." I didn't know what to say. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and in its place was a creeping numbness that spread through my limbs like cold water. I didn't think I finally managed. I just reacted. "Indeed," Vex said, and there was something in his voice that might have been approval. "That is exactly what separates a soldier from a civilian, the ability to act when thought would be too slow." He reached out a clawed hand, and I flinched instinctively. But he simply took the bone from my grip, turning it over with surprising delicacy. "This is remarkable," he murmured. "The fossilization process has created a crystalline structure that rivals steel in density. With proper sharpening, this could hold an edge sharper than most blade-forged weapons." "Sir." He looked at me, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost paternal. "Class," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent plateau. "Change of plans. We will use the remaining time to process the materials we've gathered and forge our blades in the shuttle's onboard facilities. I will take responsibility for the delay. Your assignment stands." The other students stirred. their shock giving way to the practical concerns of the assignment. Jax and Alara appeared at my side, their faces etched with worry. "Are you okay?" Alara asked, her voice low and urgent. I nodded, but the movement felt disconnected, like I was watching someone else do it from a great distance. "You're in shock," Jax said, his mandibles clicking in what I'd come to recognize as concern. "Your species doesn't process traumatic events well. You need to sit down, drink water, let your system regulate." "He's right," Alara added. "Come on, let's get you to the shuttle." They guided me back to the landing zone, their hands gentle but firm on my arms. Other students had gathered around the creature's carcass, examining it with the clinical curiosity of academics who had never seen death up close. Instructor Vex was directing the recovery efforts, his wounds already bandaged with the emergency kit from the shuttle. The portable forge station was set up just outside the shuttle's main hatch, a compact unit that hummed with contained energy. There were other students already working on their blades, the sound of hammers on metal echoing across the plateau. But I couldn't focus on that. All I could see was the bone, still in Instructor Vex's possession, and all I could feel was the phantom weight of it in my hands. I sat down on a crate near the forge station, my legs finally giving out. Alara pressed a canteen of water into my hands, and I drank mechanically, not tasting anything. "That was insane, you know that," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a thread of amazement. "You charged a Kellyan sandcrawler with a piece of bone, a bone." "I didn't know what else to do," I said, my voice hollow. "He was going to die. We were all going to die." "Maybe, but you didn't freeze. You didn't run. You picked up a piece of garbage and you ran toward the thing that was trying to kill us all. That's," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know what that is, but it's not normal." "It's human," Jax said from somewhere behind me. I hadn't even noticed him approach. "The human response to danger is often characterized by counterintuitive aggression. They don't always fight or flight. Sometimes they fight, even when flight would be the more logical choice." "I'm not a case study," I said, more sharply than I intended. "No," Jax agreed, his tone unbothered. "You're a survivor. There's a difference." Instructor Vex approached the group, the fossilized bone still in his hand. I noticed now that he'd done something to it, cleaned it of ichor and debris until it gleamed a pale, bone white. "You," he said, pointing at me with a clawed finger, "come here." I stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else and walked over to where he stood. The forge station was glowing with contained heat, and I could feel the warmth from 3 meters away. "I said there would be no exceptions to the assignment," Vex said, his voice carrying that familiar note of cold authority. "However, in light of the circumstances, I am making a modification to the rules." He held out the bone to me. "You have already begun the forging process. This is your raw material. Your task is to complete it. Sharpen this bone into a blade that meets the assignment standards." I stared at the bone, then at him, then back at the bone. "Sir, it's a bone, it's not I can't." "You can," Vex interrupted. "You've already proven you can. The question is whether you have the discipline to finish what you started." He pressed the bone into my hands. It was lighter than I expected, smoother too, the rough edges having been knocked off in the struggle. The broken end was still jagged, still sharp, but it would need more work to become a proper blade. "The forge station will be available for the next 2 hours, Vex continued. "Use it, or don't, the choice is yours. But I expect to see a completed blade at the end of this time." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with a piece of bone in my hands and a galaxy of questions swirling through my head. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. I approached the forge station with a sense of dread I couldn't quite articulate. The bone felt wrong in my hands, like I was holding something that didn't belong to me. But it was mine now, or at least, it was my responsibility. I had killed a creature with this bone. I had saved a life with this bone. The least I could do was honor it by finishing the job. The forge station was a marvel of compact engineering. It combined a high-temperature furnace, an anvil, and a cooling vat into a single unit that could fit in the back of a shuttle. The controls were intuitive, designed to be operated by anyone with even the most basic understanding of metallurgy. But I wasn't working with metal, I was working with bone. Alara appeared at my side, her expression serious. I looked up the properties of fossilized bone in the database, she said, holding up her datapad. The mineralization process replaces the original organic material with minerals from the surrounding environment. In this case, the soil on Vexus 7 is rich in iron and silicon, so the fossilization has actually created a kind of natural composite material. It's harder than standard bone, but it's still brittle. You'll need to be careful. How careful? Very. If you apply too much heat, it will shatter. If you apply too much pressure, it will crack. You're essentially working with glass, except glass doesn't have the same grain structure, so it's even more unpredictable. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. So I have to treat it like glass. That's not reassuring. No, Alara agreed. It's not, but it's what you've got. I approached the forge station and laid the bone on the anvil. The heat from the furnace was intense, even at a distance, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead. I picked up the bone, holding it in my hands, and I thought about what I was trying to do. I was going to make a blade. Not just any blade. A blade that had already proven its worth in combat. A blade that had killed a predator that could have killed all of us. I owed it to that moment to make sure the blade was worthy. I started with the rough edge. The bone was already sharp from the struggle, but it was uneven, jagged, and I needed to make it consistent. I used a coarse grinding stone from the forge station's toolkit, working the edge carefully, trying not to apply too much pressure. The bone scraped against the stone, a sound like sandpaper on wood. I could feel the vibration through my hands, a subtle feedback that told me when I was hitting the right angle and when I was going too deep. Alara watched in silence, her datapad forgotten in her hands. I worked the edge for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. The rough, jagged surface slowly gave way to a smoother line, a continuous curve that followed the natural shape of the bone. The point was still sharp, maybe even sharper than before, and I could see the way the light caught the edge, reflecting off the mineralized surface. Not bad, Alara said quietly. You've got a natural hand for this. It's just pressure and angle, I said, not looking up. Anyone could do it. Not anyone, she disagreed. The Velari would be too precise, too perfect. They'd lose the natural character of the material. The Zartanians would try to apply too much force and end up cracking it. The Borog wouldn't even try. She paused. You're the only one who understands what this is. What is it? A survivor like you. I stopped working and looked at her. Her expression was open, honest, without a trace of the usual academic detachment that characterized most of our classmates. That's a strange thing to say, I said. Is it? This bone belonged to something that lived and died on this planet. It was buried in the soil for thousands of years, maybe more. The minerals from the earth slowly replaced its structure, turning it into something new, something that could survive. And then you found it and you used it, and now you're making it into something else. Something that will survive even longer. I looked at the bone in my hands. It was smooth now, the rough edges tamed into a functional shape, but it was still a bone. Still the remains of something that had lived and died here. Survival isn't about fighting, I said softly. It's about adapting, changing to meet the moment. Exactly, Alara said. That's what you did, that's what you're doing now. I returned to the grinding stone, working the edge with renewed purpose. The vibration through my hands was almost meditative now, a rhythmic pulse that anchored me to the moment. I could feel the bone under my fingers, could feel the way the grain shifted and changed as I worked. After another 20 minutes, I held the blade up to the light. The edge was keen, a continuous curve that caught the fading orange of the sky and reflected it back. The point was needle-sharp, the kind of sharp that could punch through hide and scale and maybe even armor. "This is good," I said, not sure if I was talking to Alara or to myself. "This is really good." "The assignment requires a handle," she reminded me, "and you need to test the edge on the calibration material." I nodded, setting to work on the handle. The bone was long enough that I could fashion a grip from the base, wrapping it in the leather-like material from the forge station supplies. The process was slower than I expected, the wrapping having to be perfect to ensure a secure grip. But I worked carefully, deliberately, and by the time I was done, the blade felt like an extension of my own hand. The calibration test was next. I approached the testing station, where a piece of standard armor plating was mounted on a stand. The assignment required the blade to be able to cut through a specific thickness of material without shattering. I raised the blade, positioning myself, and brought it down. The bone sliced through the armor plating like it was made of paper. I stared at the clean cut, the edges so smooth they almost looked machine-made. Alara was beside me, her eyes wide with wonder. "That's not possible," she breathed. "That's military-grade composite. It should have resisted even if the blade was sharp. That should have shattered it." But it hadn't. The bone was intact, the edge still pristine, and there wasn't even a hint of a crack or chip. Instructor Vex appeared at my side, his yellow eyes fixed on the severed armor plating. He reached out a clawed hand and took the blade from me, turning it over with the same delicate attention he'd used earlier. "Remarkable," he said. "The fossilization process has created a grain structure that actually aligns with the edge, providing natural sharpness that rivals any manufactured blade. This is something else." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You've done it," he said. "You've not only completed the assignment, you've exceeded every expectation. This blade is worthy of a commendation." I felt a surge of something that might have been pride, mixed with a healthy dose of disbelief. I just turned a piece of bone into a weapon that could cut through armor, with a forge station that wasn't even designed for organic materials. With a technique I'd basically improvised as I went along. "Thank you, sir," I managed. Vex nodded, then turned to the class, his voice carrying across the plateau. "Students, the time for the assignment is complete. Please present your blades for evaluation. The top 3 will receive commendations." The other students shuffled forward, presenting their blades with varying degrees of confidence. Most were functional, a few were quite good, and one, from the Borog, surprisingly, was actually beautiful, its surface gleaming with a polished sheen that caught the fading light. But when they saw my blade, their expressions changed. "How is that possible?" one of the Velari asked, her blue skin flushing with something that might have been jealousy. "That's a bone. Bones are porous. They can't hold an edge like that." "Normally, no," Instructor Vex said, "but this bone has been fossilized in a mineral-rich environment. The process has created a natural composite stronger than anything we could manufacture with standard techniques." He paused, looking at me. "This blade is exceptional. It will be entered into the Hall of Commendations." The class was silent. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of awe and disbelief and maybe a little bit of fear. I looked at the blade in my hands, at the way it caught the dying light, at the memories it carried. It wasn't just a blade. It was a reminder of what I'd done, what I'd survived, what I'd become. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought formed, a thought that would shape everything that came after. This is what humans do. This is what we've always done. We take the bones of our enemies, the fragments of our failures, and we forge them into something new, something stronger, something that can survive.